So Brian, when did you become interested in aviation?
Well, I think as long ago as I can remember, actually, because my father was a pilot in the Second World War, and from being a toddler I knew that he'd done that, and of course it's sort of natural to want to find out more about it, and also probably to emulate him, as I always thought I probably would.
Yeah.
And indeed did.
So what year did you join the RAF?
I joined the RAF in 1965, direct entry commission through South Cerney, so I spent 16 weeks at South Cerney, and then I already had a flying scholarship with the Air Training Corps, and so I went straight through to flying the Jet Provost at Basic Flying School, just down the road from here at Syerston.
Could you talk us through some of your basic training and what aircraft you actually flew?
Yeah, well, as I said, I just started off on the Jet Provost. It was the all through jet training period of the Royal Air Force, so it was just under a year at Syerston flying the JP3, and then when you became the senior course, the JP4. I was 6'5". Well, I am 6'5", would be a better way of putting it, but so I had to be measured before they would accept me as a pilot. I went to Cranwell for a day where they measured me sitting down, standing up, and eventually they cleared me to fly the JP, but sadly they explained that the NAT being the advanced train at the time, I would never fly fast jets, whether I was good enough or not, because I basically couldn't fit into the thing. And so after passing out, getting my wings at Syerston in '66, I went down to Oakington, 5 FTS, and flew the Varsity for 6 months, doing my twin engine conversion, and of course that's when I got acquainted with piston engines again. Straight through from there to St Morgan and the Maritime Operational Training Unit on the Shackleton. I was very lucky in that, unlike some pilots of that era, I went basically straight from one posting to another and didn't have to hold anywhere. Yes, big, old, noisy. I think noisy more than anything else. Yeah. And it got a tail wheel, which I'd only ever flown in a tail wheel aircraft once, which was an old Oster at what was then the Beagle factory at Rearsby. So the 3-point attitude for landing, and also, of course, having 10 extra crew, well, 9 other crew members with you, was quite an experience. But the QFIs were very good. They were all, a lot of them were World War II or just after World War II coastal experts, and so basically you soon settle down and realise that it's a bit heavy to fly, a bit noisy, but very good at what it did, you know, which was drone along over the sea at low level for hours on end, basically.
So how much ground school did you receive?
I think we did about 3 weeks before we actually were allowed to get airborne at all, just learning the basic systems of the aircraft. And then we interspersed ground school with flying for the conversion phase. There are 2 phases to the course. The conversion phase for the pilots and air engineers, and then the applied phase where you joined up with the rear crew members who'd been studying their equipment in the meantime. I think it was something like 16 conversion sorties, then about 12 applied sorties in a period of 6 months was the course in total.
Yeah. So can you tell us about your first flight?
In the Shackleton, I know the QFI was Jim Cooper, I can remember that, and we went off and did about 2 hours familiarisation around St Morgan, and I'm not sure if we didn't do the max crit speed run, which is when you throttle 2 engines back on one side and you hold the rudder and slow down until finally it won't fly anymore, and that was the minimum speed that you were ever allowed to go in the aeroplane to avoid an accident. I think that may have been done at that early stage, but because after that we went into the circuit and pounded the circuit for quite a long time, getting used to trying to land a grandson of a Lancaster with big Lincoln type tyres and no brakes.
Yeah.
Well,
could you tell us some of the training sorties you actually did?
Well, as I say, yeah, the conversion phase, you would just pound the circuit, do instrument approaches, get your instrument rating, and then after that you would be signed up as first pilot on the aeroplane day and night, which was different to a lot of commands where the co-pilot, the future co-pilots would be definitely right-hand seat. We were trained first pilot day and night from the square one. And then we went off with the crew with the applied sorties, and we didn't have a QFI with us. We had what they called an MAI, a maritime air instructor, who was a very experienced pilot, but not necessarily there to teach the pilots to fly the aeroplane, but how to use the aeroplane. Because really in a maritime aircraft, it's 90% using the aeroplane and 10% taking off and landing, you know. Yeah. And we flew with our student crew and did practice tactics using radar buoys to simulate submarines. We would fly against skid targets towed by a launch and practice bombing moving target, and the navigators would practice their plotting tactics for investigating surface contacts in an area, things like that, all very much maritime orientated. And eventually you would be given an exercise scenario where you went to an area and you didn't know what to expect, and the crew had to work it out with the minimum inputs of the best thing to do and to achieve the aim of the sortie, which was basically your final handling test, if you like. Yeah. But then we all split up and went to different squadrons and crews. So although we had sort of crew cooperation drilled into us, we didn't actually exit as a crew. We exited as individuals to various squadrons and joined established crews.
So talking about the crews, how many crews were on board the Shackleton?
Normally crew was 10, 2 pilots, 2 navigators, an air engineer, and then 5 what they called signallers at the start of my time. Then they all became air electronics operators. They'd be called Withers these days, but it shows how the Air Force moves on. Normally one of those was an officer and the other 4 were senior NCOs. So obviously the pilots flew the aeroplane, the navigators navigated, the air engineer, I don't know what the air engineer did really, apart from write down the fuel every hour and tell the nav we hadn't run out. No, that's been a bit rude to our engineers. They're very, very nice chaps. Yeah. But the rear crew, I mean, you're starting at the front, they were practiced in gunnery, wireless operator, which was the old Morse HF radio back to base, very important that we kept in contact. And then we had sonar, radar, beam lookouts, photography, tail lookout. So, and galley, of course, the most important sensor on the airplane, the galley, where you kept all the people happy. And so they were jack of all trades and probably master of most, actually. Flying the aircraft wasn't just flying the aircraft, it was putting the aircraft in the right position at the right time, if you like, particularly in tactical situations. Because the navigator had no screen where he knew what was going on in the sense of a digital type setup, it was all mandrolic, and so we would be left to position the aircraft to be ready to do what we anticipated the next tactic would be, and also to fly as accurately as possible when they're doing astronavigation, of course, which is something that doesn't happen these days. Plus we were experts at telling what the surface wind was by just looking out the window, and we would help the nav out by giving him updates on the wind if it looks like it changed to help his problem. Because you've got to realise in those days the nav system was a pencil and a ruler basically.
Yeah. So could you tell us what squadrons you were based with?
On the Shackleton, just 42 Squadron. I did 4 years and a little bit on 42 Squadron prior to Nimrod conversion. The start of my career was a bit protracted because we were frozen in post pending the Nimrod coming into service, and in fact we were one of the last UK squadrons to convert on 42. I think it was beginning of 72, something April 72 we finally got to the Nimrod OCU. So I spent quite a lot longer than a co-pilot than I particularly wanted, but in that time I had got a master green instrument rating, which is the best you could get in those days, plus I'd also got a personal category which was above average. So, you know, I was trying to do the best I could, but I never ever became a captain on Shackletons for that reason. There were a lot more experienced people who were all frozen in post until the Nimrod came in.
Yeah. Where was this squadron based at?
It was St Morgan in Cornwall, which is now Newquay Airport, of course. But we had a sort of secondary operating base of Gibraltar because we were one of the southern Shackleton squadrons, so we spent quite a time detaching to Gibraltar if there was any interesting activity either entering or leaving the Mediterranean.
So So did anything interesting happen to you while you were on the squadron?
Oh, yes. I mean, obviously, with never knowing what you're going to come across when you get airborne, we had several incidents. One that springs to mind is we were operating out of the Mediterranean, actually down off Cyprus. Our task was to detect and track a Soviet surveillance hydrographic survey vessel, and we were flying down very near the 12-mile limit off Egypt when all of a sudden a MiG-21 came whistling by the right wingtip, which we thought was quite interesting, and as it wasn't maintaining height, so we turned north and it came by again, and it was descending towards the water, and there was an interesting conversation between myself and the captain as to whether we ought to put out a mayday relay if he fell in the water. But it was all totally legal and above board, but they just came to have a look at us, which was quite unusual at 500 feet for a jet to intercept you like that.
Yeah.
There are several other things on search and rescue. I mean, for instance, I took off once from St Morgan and the nose wheel wouldn't retract, but we had to deliver drugs to a trawler, so we flew all the way out with the nose wheel down at reduced speed, dropped the drugs to the Navy ship whose doctor was going to help the seaman on the trawler, and then we flew back with the nose wheel down and landed again.
Wow.
Or S&R again, over the channel, we were trying to help a lifeboat. There's a ship had run into the wreck of a ship that had sunk the previous week, and the Dover lifeboat was out, and they asked us to drop flares. Well, we used to carry a what we called a 4.5-inch recce flare in the bomb bay, so we climbed up to 4,000 feet to drop it because it was a parachute type flare. But then we had to clear the area on radar to drop the flare, because obviously you don't want to hit a ship, particularly if the parachute doesn't open. It's just what they call an incendiary bomb then. And there were tankers and all sorts, and the radar was struggling like mad to find us a clear path, and eventually we were dropping flares with sort of close your eyes and press the button and hope for the best, because the poor old lifeboat was wanting help and we were not allowed to give it. But then he got his own back, because we came hurtling down to 500 feet, said, can we fire a flare ourselves? And we said, certainly. So we climbed up to 1,000, which we were briefed was the safety height in those days for rocket flares from lifeboats, when this flare burst above us, and we thought, that's interesting. And apparently they got a new rocket flare which went up to 1,200 feet, and nobody had bothered to tell Coastal Command. So there we are. That was a fairly interesting trip.
It is interesting, yeah. So do you think the Shackleton was the right aircraft for the job at the time?
Oh yes, I think definitely it was the right aircraft for the job. It was an aircraft the rest of the Air Force didn't understand, but it could go out, stay a long time. The only problem was it was very noisy, and towards the end of its life it did have operational limitations because it didn't have a long-range passive sonar system. The LOFAR Jezebel system was available in P3s and would come into service in the Nimrod. So really the reason the Shackleton left service because it wasn't up to the job, but that was because the Russians sneakily started building nuclear submarines like they were going out of fashion.
What was the longest sortie you ever carried out?
Oh, I'm a wimp because I joined late. This aircraft became quite heavy. I mean, when it was built, so the Mark III could do 24 hours. When I flew them, I reckon you would be pushed to get 15, 18 hours on military reserves. And to answer your question directly, 12 hours 25 was the longest I've ever done, which is probably quite short. If any Shackleton people watch this, they'll probably say, what a wimp, you know.
That's long to me.
Just depends if the galley's working and the Elson doesn't get full.
So how did other forces and nations view the Shackleton, given its age?
Well, I think, yeah, I think we got a very good reputation in anti-submarine warfare, which was its primary war role, of course. And we were very much on a par with the early P3s, apart from the lack of the Jezebel sonar system. But we held our own in all sorts of exercises, and you know, at the Shackleton period, things like the Portuguese were still flying Neptunes, which were even older, and the Dutch had the Dutch had Neptunes, yeah. The Norwegians, they had P3s eventually, but we were very much, as I say, even at the end of its life, which is the only time I really knew the Shackleton, it was very much up with the going expertise, mainly because of the crews were so experienced. You know, I mean, a lot of guys back from wartime period. I was as a young co-pilot, I was learning amazing things and listening to the exploits of warrant officer, 50-year-old warrant officers who we were flying down to Gibraltar once. We got to Cape Finisterre, and one of our signallers came up, stood between the pilots, and he says, "Is that Cape Finisterre lighthouse down there?" And I said, "Certainly is." And he said, "Oh, I ditched in a Wellington just near there in 1943. So, you know.
Yeah. So how many hours did you get on Shackletons, and did you enjoy it?
Just short of 2,000 hours in total, and yeah, by and large, yes. There were odd times when the weather would make it not so enjoyable, because obviously we operated at low level quite a lot, so it'd be quite bumpy, particularly search and rescue. If it was your turn to do the landing, and you had a dark and dirty night, you know, with a strong crosswind, sometimes you thought, you know, is this what I ought to be doing? But by and large, it was very good. And of course, we had excellent crews, and we got on very well. We did everything. We were what we call constituted crews, and we did everything together, and we became firm friends. I'm still in touch with a guy that used to be our rations man back in 1968, you know.
So Brian, then you move on to Nimrod. When did this happen?
Well, at the time, the Nimrod was being introduced into the RAF, so we did squadron conversion. I actually, although we were nominally still on 42 Squadron, we started the Nimrod conversion course at the end of 1971, and it was a 3-month course going through until about April 72, when, as if by magic, we became number 203 Squadron and went out to Malta to replace the Shackletons that had been there before. And so we were, as a crew, from a Shackleton crew, we became a Nimrod crew, and this time we did stay together. And so the pilots were still reading the pilot's notes as we were flying down to Malta, thinking, you know, have we got to landing yet? How do you... No, it's not quite that bad, but I mean, quite interesting that a brand new jet that the pilots had probably got something on the order of 100 hours each on it, and we were sent off on our own to take it out to Malta.
Yeah.
So we did, I think it was 9 conversion sorties, similar system to the Shackleton, 9 conversion sorties orientated towards the pilots, circuit flying, instrument flying, culminating in instrument rating, and then I think it was 12 applied sorties where you would learn to use the new displays. Basically, the sensors were virtually the same as the Mark III Shackleton. The radar was the same, the sonar was the same. We had the addition of the low-fire Jezebel system we've talked about already, long-range passive sonar, so we could hunt nuclears this time as well. So a little bit more tactics involved, but of course for a worked-up crew, it was quite a lot easier than doing it from basics as we did on the 6-month course some years earlier.
So how different was it compared to the Shackleton?
Well, the biggest difference, I think, will become apparent if you ever go in a Shackleton, is that in a Nimrod you can get in the door at the back and you can walk all the way to the front, and it doesn't, there's nothing to climb over, which was a major advantage. Plus they said that all the equipment will be stowed on board, so you won't have to carry out a busload of bags and reference material and things. It turned out to be a lie, but it was a good idea at the time. But from a pilot's point of view, the main thing was it could climb. I mean, a Shackleton, we would go off, and if you got up to 2,000 feet, that was pretty high, you know. With the Nimrod, it was very much airliner performance, and you could cruise up to 30,000 feet, descend into your area. Our areas were blocked from 20,000 feet and below normally. So we had much more tactical freedom, we could get to places, and we had better sensors. So all round, much better anti-submarine warfare platform.
Was there a big difference in the cockpit layout?
Oh yes, quite a bit. The Shackleton can take its history back to the Lancaster via the Lincoln, whereas the Nimrod was based on an airliner, the Comet 4. So you have a Comet type flight deck with, you still have an air engineer and he's on the flight deck with you, but you have a centre console with the throttles, the autopilot, flight directors, all that sort of thing, very similar to airliners right up to today, but not quite as sophisticated instrument system. But yeah, much cleaner, nicer, and the three of you sat together rather than the pilot being up in the cockpit, and there's a walkway between to get to the bomb aimer's position in the Shackleton, things like that. So it was pretty atypical as a 4-engine large aeroplane.
Yeah. So did the Nimrod have the same role as the Shackleton?
Yes, exactly. Anti-submarine warfare was its primary role, but of course maritime surveillance of all sorts, and all the Cold War tasks that would come up, and in peacetime, search and rescue was a big role. We had 2 aircraft on standby, 24 hours, 7 days a week, in case of any emergency at sea. Initially, the Nimrod couldn't drop the survival gear that the Shackleton did, so a squadron of Shackletons were kept on at Honington, actually, designated 204 Squadron, purely for search and rescue.
Oh, okay.
Well, the problem was the Lindholm gear was 140 feet, 140 knots were the dropping parameters for a Shackleton, whereas a Nimrod couldn't do 140 knots. So they eventually modified the Lindholm gear so that it could be dropped at 300 feet, 200 knots, which meant it was within the flight envelope of the Nimrod. So it was soon sorted out, but it was just a little anomaly when the Nimrod came into service.
And how many crew did it have?
12 normally on the Nimrod, 2 pilots, 2 navigators again, an air engineer, and then 7 guys down the back, because they were split now into wet and dry, as it were. That's what we used to call them. They were acoustics operators, the wet men, and radar, ESM and radio men were the dry men, as we called them. So it was the first time that everybody didn't do everything. You know, the AEO was once again in charge of the 2 shifts, so he had basically three wetmen and 3 drymen to play with. And the AEO himself would dabble with most things, and he had a seat called the Martel seat by the nav, so he could act as a coordinator and see the tactical situation when things were developing. You know, whereas the pilots didn't. Of course, we still had to work it all out on the back of a TAP, a terminal approach chart. We used to stick it up in the front and draw pictures on it, just because we never did get a tactical display of maritime at the front, so you knew what was going on.
So what squadrons were you based with on the Nimrod? Well,
the Nimrod initially, as I've already said, 203 Squadron, went out to Malta for 3.5 years. Then, strangely enough, I got a TCAT, as we called it, a training category in maritime operations. So my next tour was as a simulator instructor, because once the Nimrod had only been in service about 5 years, so the experienced people were few and far between. It's not something I wanted to do, but I did it. And then I went on to 120 Squadron at Kinloss, so I became a captain on there, till I found the tunnel later on. At 1980, I went down to 51 Squadron at Whitton on the Nimrod R1, and that I stayed there for the rest of my career, basically, either on the squadron or associated with the squadron's activities, tasking them laterally.
Do you have any memorable stories from the time on the Nimrod?
I can remember once we were flying into Akrotiri, in Cyprus, that is, and it was the time that the Turkish and Greeks were having a little confrontation between themselves, and the Turks invaded northern Cyprus. We were just turning finals onto Akrotiri when the ESM came up and said, "Fire control, lock on," and he was a young sergeant, and immediately the warrant officer just said, expletive, that's the PAR, the precision approach radar. So we weren't being locked onto at all, but it concentrated people's minds to start with. And then I did one of the longer Nimrod sorties I've ever done. I think it was the Greek Phantoms sank a Greek destroyer off Akrotiri, which was very much blue on blue, and we flew out of Akrotiri as a neutral observer, doing search and rescue, trying to locate and organise rescues for the crewmen that were in the sea, which was another interesting time. There are lots of things that seem out of the ordinary to us, but probably, to your viewers would not seem that unusual. But one day we were actually out, it was the 24th of December, as it always was when something happened, and we were tasked to go out and find this Russian ship that was transiting to the west of Ireland. And so we duly went down, found it, took some pictures of it, and by then it was sort of, we've made our way back. It was probably something like 2 o'clock on Christmas morning, and we called up to Scottish radar to get a clearance up to high level, transit back. And you know, the normal call, Scottish, Mill, this is us, we would like to climb up to flight level 310, go home. And they said, direct Kinloss? And we said, yes, if possible. They said, anything's possible, you're the only aircraft on our radar.
So did you ever fly in large exercises?
Yeah, a lot of the time we would participate in, from Kinloss, the NATO exercises. Trying to think what it was called. Dawn Patrol, would it be, possibly? Or was that Mediterranean? I'm afraid at this length of time afterwards, but yeah, all major NATO exercises involving maritime presence we would participate, because obviously we were a part of the NATO defence system for the North Atlantic, all part of Shackleton, as he was known, Senior Allied Commander Atlantic, and we were in, we did the East Atlantic bit and the Americans did the West Atlantic bit. And in the Mediterranean similarly, half our squadron was actually assigned to CENTO in the old Central Treaty Organisation, and we had responsibilities down into the Indian Ocean from there, as well as NATO responsibilities towards the NATO shipping in the Mediterranean, guarding the American fleet that was normally floating around there somewhere.
So Brian, did you fly in the Gulf War?
The first Gulf War, yes. I mean, we jumped forward quite a bit in time. We're now talking about 51 Squadron, the Nimrod R1. I was the flight commander ops on the squadron during the first Gulf War and organised the deployment, and then we flew mainly from out of theatre from Cyprus, doing surveillance missions along the Iraqi border, basically. I think that's probably no great secret, but aspects of what we did, I'm afraid, are something I can't really talk about even to this day. But certainly we contributed quite a lot to taking down the Iraqi air defence system, along with our friends in the rivet joints from the USAF. And also we did surveillance missions in the Mediterranean in the build-up to the war to ensure that there weren't any terrorist, unforeseen terrorist activities, etc., to threaten our base in Cyprus and threaten the major supply chain going through Egypt out to Saudi.
So, how many hours on Nimrod did you get, and did you enjoy flying it?
Overall, I flew the MR1 and the R1, and something like 7,000 hours in the end, just over 7,000 hours, of which 5,000 were on 51 Squadron, so you can see I was there for an extended period. But yes, it was what we used to say was we get bored in interesting places on 51. The autopilot did most of the work, as you've probably gathered.
Yeah. So Brian, do you have any hobbies?
Yeah, well, lots actually. Bird watching is one of my main hobbies, from dating back 50, 60 years now. But recently, since I retired, I've been concentrating on flight simulators, PC type based flight simulators, particularly Microsoft's series of flight simulators up till FS10 that they're using at the moment. I've been writing software, but now I tend not to do it. Because it's getting a bit more complicated, I tend now to be a beta tester for other people's software rather than writing my own. That and travelling, of course. We've got children living in Florida, or children and grandchildren living in Florida, so we go over there most years to have an extended holiday with them, because otherwise my wife wouldn't see her granddaughters. Yeah.
Do you have a favourite tipple?
Depends. Gin and tonic anywhere in the world, but in Scotland, Jura, the Isle of Jura whiskey. I think that sums that up.
Which did you prefer to fly, the Shackleton or Nimrod?
Oh dear, that's very hard. I think you've got to say Nimrod, but the Shackleton at low level, because of the way the gunner's position sticks out in front of you, you've got a good visual reference. You can actually manoeuvre the Shackleton much more easily at low level than the Nimrod. Even though it's manual controls, it's very progressive, And so most fun, I think, is a Shackleton at low level with lots of power on. You didn't go very fast, but you could turn quite well.
Is there an aircraft you wish you could have flown?
I'm not really thought about that all that much, although the only one that's really impressed me when we were operational with them is the Buccaneer. So I think Buccaneer S2 is probably something I would have loved to have a go at, but of course probably too big to fit in it. So that's I did once fly in the back seat of a Tornado, but that's quite big, but it's not the same sort of, being in the navigator's seat is not really what a pilot wants to be, you know.
And finally, do you ever get sick of talking about aviation?
Not really, but perhaps at the end of a long day here, when I've been asked the same question about 50 times about the Shackleton, my patience is becoming a bit thin. But if you ask my wife, she'll say, I wish, you know, because I tend, I think, to watch it on the television and talk about it quite a lot.
Well, Brian, thanks very much for being on the show.
Pleasure.